So it's a great pleasure to introduce Donna Sacuta. She's the executive director of the BC Labor Heritage Center, and the BC Labor Heritage Center, and you're going to hear about it from Donna. The Society preserves, documents, and presents the rich history of working people and their unions in British Columbia. Donna is a lifelong resident of BC. She's been guiding the work of the center and supporting its projects since 2017, and her career has included periods in broadcasting, administrative support, political organizing, research, and small business, where she acquired a wide range of transferable skills. And the Heritage Center has been an important partner and kind of inspiration for us in doing this work, because they really are the epicenter for labor history in this province. So Donna, over to you, and we'll have some questions for you after you speak.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. I want to acknowledge that SFU Surrey is located on the unceded traditional territories of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kaikait, and Tsawwassen nations. As Sarah gave you some of my biography, I do have a Bachelor of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies from Carleton University in Ottawa. I've had a varied career where I acquired diverse skills such as working as a volunteer, recruiting volunteers, scheduling, communications, event organizing, researching, writing, all of which I've discovered are skills that are transferable to the job that I now hold. And what motivates me? Well, I really enjoy organizing things. I enjoy writing lists, and I enjoy crossing things off a list. And ultimately, an early career in journalism means that I love a good story, and I love doing the research that makes it a good story. So the topic of, that's me, by the way. The topic of our discussion today was finding working people in the archives. What I'm proposing to do for you today is to describe what archives mean to an organization like the BC Labor Heritage Center. What have been the barriers that we've faced in accessing archives, and what they tell us and what they can tell us. So initially, I'm going to do for you a history of the BC Labor Heritage Center, describe some of our early projects, some of our experiences in exploring and using archives, some work we've done on creating our own archives, and some of the examples of how we have used archival sources in our project work. So starting off with what is the BC Labor Heritage Center, it's a group of, it began in 2004, and this is actually our 20th year, which is pretty good for a small nonprofit society. It has been, it began as a working group of trade unionists, some who were retired, some who were soon to retire, and some who were still working, who had an interest in history. And they got together and thought about what they wanted to do to preserve their stories of their lives as labor leaders. BC has traditionally been the most unionized province in Canada, initially through the prevalence of resource industries, transitioning now into more service, going from the private sector to the public sector for unionists. So when this group of people came together to form a society, they established a couple of goals, which were put in the Constitution, that they wanted to preserve, document, and present the rich history of working people and their unions in British Columbia. And they wanted to engage in partnerships and projects that help define and express the role that work and workers have played in the province. Now, it was 2 years ago that our board of directors decided to revisit that mission and goals, and they added a couple of new ones. Firstly, that we wanted to center voices that have previously been left out, including the stories of all races and genders, Indigenous workers and organizations, and to broaden our educational and intergenerational connections using varied media, connecting our themes from both past and to present. So initially, the founders believed that The stories of working people, working class people, were valuable, but like many historical groups, those stories were not represented in traditional histories. So led by a labor leader by the name of Jack Monroe, who had recently retired as president of the International Woodworkers of America, their immediate goal was to establish a bricks and mortar center on a piece of land in Burnaby. Well, let's build a center, they said. It was a very ambitious plan. It would include its own performing arts center, its own archive, not sure they even knew what that was, and an outdoor exhibit area that contained memorials to workers. More than a few years had been put into this project when it became apparent that the cost of building and maintaining such a center, even though the city of Burnaby was willing to donate a piece of property, it was way more than they could sustain. So after 4 years in 2008, the decision was made to switch directions. And instead of trying to build a center, they decided to turn to doing project-based work and began leveraging partnerships with other organizations. One of the very first of those was the Vancouver Convention Center, which was being built on the waterfront at that time. It was a result of, I think, Jack Monroe's connections in the community that the center and the people planning the center made a deliberate choice, a deliberate decision that when constructing the center and planning it, that the artwork around and in the center would reflect upon the history of labor and working people in BC. So you may not realize that the Vancouver Convention Center's artwork is largely based on labor history. So inside and outside the convention center, there are over 60 educational panels that highlight stories of workers, unions, and various occupations. And this is an example of a plaque on the exterior. If you've ever heard of Ginger Goodwin, or if you haven't, he's often regarded as British Columbia's first labor martyr. Goodwin was a coal miner and a union organizer in Trail in the Kootenays during the time of the First World War. And he had been excluded from military service because his health was poor. But once he started organizing a union and strikes in Trail, the government changed their minds. They thought that he should go to war. He should be conscripted to serve in Europe. And he ran. And he ran to Vancouver Island near Cumberland and hid. And he was shot by a BC provincial police officer. And his death sparked Canada's very first general strike. So there's Ginger's plaque. Now, at the Convention Center, there's also physical artwork. This is the line of work sculpture by BC artist Jill Anholt. It's a piece of art that celebrates the evolution I alluded to between the growth of the workforce in BC from resource-based employment to more technologically emerging technologies and innovative work. There's also, more recently, something that the BC Labour Heritage Centre, us, did almost 2 years ago, as we installed a sculpture at the Vancouver Convention Centre. It's the first public memorial in North America that honors the thousands of victims who have died or been impacted by exposure to asbestos. And asbestos remains the largest killer of workers in British Columbia because of the latency period. You can have been exposed to asbestos fibers 20, 30, 40 years ago, and the symptoms don't appear until now. The artist was Doug Taylor, who's a Vancouver artist, and he creates kinetic sculptures that move. And this sculpture is called Wind Wheelmobile. It's the centerpiece of the asbestos memorial. It moves with the wind, it spins with the wind, and the features are representative of asbestos fibers blowing in the wind and the lungs and the bronchia of a human body. So that was a sculpture that we own. The Vancouver Convention Center is hosting it for us. And we partnered probably the biggest project we've done to date. It took us 5 years. We partnered on it with WorkSafe BC, with the Pavilion Corporation of BC, the government of BC, and several unions and advocacy groups contributed. So going back a bit, one of the other important projects that we've involved in was the Working People television series, which was produced with the Knowledge Network and is still in broadcast. It contains, it's a 3-part series. It has 32 to 3 minute vignettes that we talk about. We call them vignettes. They're short chapters, like a heritage minute on stories of labor history in BC. That project was completed in 2012, but as I said, it's still in broadcast. And we've had a group of volunteer teachers who've written labor history lesson plans for schools, focused around each episode. And we're currently finishing a project to translate those lessons into French so that they're available for immersion teachers. Now, this is Jack Monroe, and I just wanted to get back to him because he had another vision. He wanted to write a new BC labor history book. And that project was well underway when he became very ill and unfortunately passed away before his dream was fulfilled. But that's when a fellow by the name of Ken Nowakowski, who's a retired teacher and a former president of the Teachers Union in BC, he took over the chair. And that was a turning point for the center. There was a book to finish writing, and there was still no archive of Labor's own. And the board continued to have more ideas than the resources to achieve them. And it was at that point that I arrived, first as a volunteer, and then as a part-time contract worker, and then I was hired as the first executive director in 2017. And I remember Ken introducing me to the center, and he said, you know, if you look at the history books, you'd think that it was the bankers and the lawyers and the business people who made British Columbia. And from that thought, we came with our slogan that working people built BC. And that became the theme of Ken's time as chair. So the book had been written at that point. They had the text on the line, A History of the British Columbia Labor Movement, but no photographs. So my job was to find 200 photographs to illustrate a 150-year history. And that's when I started to dive into archives. I was searching for a scattered and relatively unknown collection of photos that could be used in the book. So when we look initially at, if we're looking for archives of working people and labor, we ask, what is labor history? Well, I see it as distinct because it looks at class as a concept that overrides all other types of social history, be they ethnicity or gender. Class is woven through all those other kinds of history. So is labor history really about the people who make up the unions or the unions themselves? Is it the history of labor as a social movement? Or is it about events that have shaped the working class in British Columbia? And others would argue that it's just the story of workers in different industries. And I think yes is the answer to all those questions. They're all part of what the working class is. So the first step in locating these photographs was to identify archival sources. And some of the ones that we looked at were the Pacific Tribune Photograph Collection, the BC Archives, the Vancouver Archives, and special collections at UBC. But along the way, I was struck by how much other labor history was out there in archives, from paper records to audio and video recordings. And I started to present my own, create my own spreadsheet. We're going to need this information later on. And it grew to hundreds and hundreds of entries. And the question I asked myself, well, is there really a silence in the archives on labor history? Or was it a question that we're really not looking, or we don't understand where to look? So one place that popped up was a document that I found in our library at the office. It's a guide to labor records and resources in British Columbia. And that sounded like a wonderful place to start. It was written in 1985. It's in 3 parts. It's a bibliography, And the second part, most interesting, was a list of public archival holdings that hold records of interest to labor in British Columbia, mainly large archives like the BC Archives, the UBC, SFU. But part three is union offices in BC that have archives. But unfortunately, after almost 50 years, a lot of them no longer exist. So some of the places where we found other interesting collections, there's the Howie Smith collection at Royal BC Museum with 80 cassette recordings from 1975 to 1979 of labor activists and first-hand witnesses to labor history. It is not fully digitized, nor is it fully transcribed. There's the Women's Labor History Project. We also call it the Sara Diamond Project, the Sara Diamond Collection of women active in the trade union movement in British Columbia since the 1890s, and it is mostly digitized and transcribed. There's also smaller collections like the Reynoldston Research Collection, and other smaller institutions have a little bit of labor history. There's the Cole Tyee Collection at Vancouver Island University. And more recently, the IWA has created its own archives at the Katsa Station Museum. And one collection that I have been involved in doing is ensuring that more union newspapers are digitized and available online. The Pacific Tribune was just digitized last year. This year, we've got a grant to digitize the predecessor versions of the Pacific Tribune, from the BC Workers News to the Workers Advocate to the People. So that's going to be done this year. And we also digitized the Labor Statesman, which was the Vancouver and District Labor Council newspaper. And all of those are excellent sources to get stories on labor. And of course, another collection which I discovered in the Orange Book I mentioned is the BC Federation of Labor actually did their own oral history project in 1964, I discovered. And the tapes are there and they are being digitized for us. And of the few interviews I've been able to listen to, it's a magnificent collection. It's people who were alive during the Winnipeg General Strike and participated in it. There was one man who was around for what we call the Ginger Goodwin General Strike. And there's nothing better than finding the voices of people who were actually participating. So with the center, in the book complete, it was time for the center to get a new chair. And Joey Hartman, who is now the board chair, was elected in 2019. She's the former president of the Vancouver and District Labor Council, and she has a long history of union work. Currently, she's the board chair at Vancouver Community College, and she also sits on Pacific Blue Cross board. So Joy was already on our board, but she pledged to continue basically the tone set by the earlier chairs. One thing she emphasized is that in everything we do, we must use plain language and be accessible as much as possible. When we tell labor history, use a storytelling format rather than an ideological approach. And we like to link contemporary issues to events in the past. And very important as well, we are a provincial organization. We are the BC Labor Heritage Center. And although our offices are in Burnaby and we all live and work in the Lower Mainland, we have to continue to remind ourselves largely that labor history took place all over British Columbia, and we have to represent that in the projects that we work on. So what are the barriers we have found in locating working people in the archives? First of all, there's a misunderstanding, I think, of what is labor history. And I talked about some of the things we've struggled with, whether it's unions, whether it's workers, whether it's social movements. Sometimes when we go looking for labor history, we get directed to corporate archives, like Macmillan Bloedel's papers. And I know when I was looking for photographs, that was one place where I was directed, and it was all pictures of logging equipment. It wasn't workers. So there's a bit of a misunderstanding of what we want. Some of the records are non-existent or they're unknown in public archives. And sometimes there's simply mistrust of by unions that their records, if they give them to an archive, will disappear. So we have to deal with that. And what are some of the barriers that we have found for a small nonprofit organization to using archives? Well, some of the things that we want are not digitized or available online. We also find that digitization can be expensive and it requires some expertise to do it yourself. Yes, we can apply for funding for that, but the application process is daunting and onerous. Also, archives are mainly located in major centers, and that limits hours, uh, adds costs for travel for people who are not located in the Lower Mainland. And also some institutions charge licensing fees and reproduction fees, so adding another layer of preventing us to adequately access and freely access what we want. And in some cases, the records that are there are poorly organized or described. Finding aids are not necessarily user-friendly, and they're not accessible or understandable by lay people. And often the records are not diverse. But still, we persist. Some of the projects that we have used archival materials in include our podcast. We have a podcast called On the Line, Stories of BC Workers. Our labor history curriculum that we write for schools is a place that we incorporate archival materials. We do walking tours, and we have the tours started as Vancouver-centered tours, but now we have tours that are written for Victoria, Prince George, and Prince Rupert. And we have those on an app so people can do their own self-guided tours. We also use the materials in articles, newsletters, and social media, and at speaking opportunities like this. We've also begun creating our own archives. And sometimes we have things donated to us, like papers or buttons or pins. Generally, we don't maintain a big archive. We generally sort through it and donate it to another larger institution. But we've been working really hard on our oral history collection. We're starting in 2016, and to date, we're closing in on 90 interviews with labor people in British Columbia. All of those are digitized. All of them are human transcribed and freely available online. And they're being archived for long-term preservation at Simon Fraser University. As a subset of the oral history collection, we did a project starting in June of 2020, about 4 months after the pandemic began, called the COVID Chronicles BC Labor's Story. And we conducted over 60 interviews with workers and union activists around BC during the pandemic, and they were all done by Zoom because of the conditions. They tell a wide variety of stories. We are kind of backlogged on that one. They're all digitized. They're not yet transcribed. And they really, I think, are something that's going to be a really useful resource. The other project we recently became involved in was Union Zindabad, which was a project funded through the South Asian Canadian Legacy Project in 2021 and 2022. And we worked with the University of the Fraser Valley on this. And for that project, we collected another 12 oral history interviews with South Asian people who were involved in union organizing in the community. And this provided to us an opportunity to produce a book, a broad survey book on the history of the labor movement in the South Asian community. Something that we like to do is connect our projects. So we have the South Asian project, but we also have a plaques project. We're trying to create historical plaques. We call them our Plaques Around the Province project. Once the plaques at the convention center were complete, the board said, well, yeah, but if you don't live in Vancouver, you're not going to see these plaques. So we came up with a way to take labor history out to areas outside of Vancouver. So Darshan Singh Sangha was a name that came up during the South Asian Labor History Project. Last summer, we partnered with the Hari Sharma Foundation to install a cast bronze plaque in Lake Cowichan, where the IWA Archives is located. Now, Darshan Singh was a union organizer with the International Woodworkers of America in the 1940s. And he signed up South Asian lumber workers into the union, and he changed their lives by doing so as workers, but he also changed the union because he convinced the union that they needed to speak out on issues of importance to all workers and embrace all races in the union. And I mentioned our podcast, which is produced entirely by volunteers. And it's another example of how we connect our projects. The South Asian project allowed us to create an episode on Darshan Singh, drawing on archival material. So I'm going to play you an excerpt from that podcast, but first I'll just tell you about what the clip is. In 1943, Darshan, who's the person third from the left in the photo, led a march as part of a strike on Vancouver Island of woodworkers. And it's quite a famous strike. It's called the 1943 March on Victoria. It was a province-wide strike of the forest industry during the Second World War. And it was an interesting experience because the recording that we found isn't of Darshan Singh, but it's of a radio reporter who was at the demonstration. And it's the recording is housed at the Royal BC Museum in Victoria and at Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa, but it's licensed by CBC. And that was our problem. That was a costly and long process to obtain 45 seconds that we could put in a podcast. So here's a brief portion of the podcast from 1943 in Victoria. He's describing the march, and I think you'll find that the language he uses is very evocative of the era in which it took place. And the final sentence is, I believe, what connects the past to the present in this story. Can you hear it? Oh.
This is Jim Nesbitt from Victoria. I have just come from the legislative buildings where I saw thousands of striking BC woodworkers lying 3 deep. They had come to petition the government to do something to end the strike, which has kept 37,000 persons idle more than 4 weeks. The loggers, many with their wives, some with their children, waited patiently, quietly on the rain-soaked streets beside the Queen Victoria Memorial and the bubbling fountain, while their leaders conferred with the cabinet inside the massive granite seat of government. From all parts of Vancouver Island and the lower mainland came these men and women. From the deep woods where the tall timbers point to the sky, from the docks where BC's rich wood is loaded for all the world, where housing is now so sorely needed. From the roaring...
So as he said, where housing is so sorely needed. Our own collection of oral histories has also been utilized in other projects. Just this past March, to coincide with International Women's Day, we created a virtual walking tour, and it's my co-worker, Natasha Fairweather, who did a phenomenal job on this. It was a virtual walking tour on the history of women in Vancouver in the labor movement. And in it, she used a clip from one of our oral history interviews to tell the story of the Service Office and Retail Workers Union.
Office and Retail Workers Union, SORWAC, was small, grassroots, and overtly feminist. It specifically sought to organize women in occupations that were typically ignored by the established unions. Jackie Ainsworth had been working at the CIBC Victory Square branch for about 3 weeks when she learned that her colleagues were looking to take action against the unpaid overtime and favoritism they were subjected to.
And then, of course, I raised that I thought we should join a union. And everybody said, oh, yes, that's probably a good idea, but that's impossible. That's just ridiculous in terms of you know, how big CIBC is. And that was just a fantasy. And so I got home and called up Jean and Melody, and we met and we did up a leaflet saying why bank workers should be in a union. And they leafleted my branch the next morning. And just so it wouldn't look super conspicuous, they leafleted several branches on West Hastings there. A couple women in my branch really got interested in the idea. And so they started coming to Sorwak meetings.
So this was presented as a virtual walking tour that was online that people could sign into. Also, for part of the same tour, we used one of the interviews from Sara's Women's Labor History Project for the same purpose, for the Women's Labor History Walking Tour. And we used an interview with Josephine Charlie, who was a member of the Squamish Nation, born in 1898, and worked in the fish canneries for many years. And here she describes what it was like in the 1920s and the 1930s.
Oh, we'd work from 7 to sometimes midnight. Oh, we'd work, and the woman on the line worked till 1 o'clock as the line's going, you know. And the ones cooking would be there till 2 or 3 in the morning. And we'd work all hours from then on. That's the sockeye season. And then the pinks come in, that's where we pretty die. They come by the thousands. Sometimes one sailboat would get 20,000, 30,000. You could see them come around the pond just like if they were swaying, you know. They're so full of fish. Oh, we're all grown.
So Josephine was active in the Native Brotherhood Union and later became a shop steward with the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union. I want to take a little bit more time to describe a relatively unknown collection that we're working now to share more broadly. It's called the David York Labor History Collection at Simon Fraser University. And that's David on the right. David began collecting union pins at the age of 10. When his mother, who worked for the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union, would bring home union buttons every year. And this was a time there was no union dues checkoff. You had to pay your dues every year to the shop steward, who would come around, collect your dues, and in return you'd get a button that you would wear to prove that you were a union member. So every year she'd bring home a new colored button and David would collect it. Well, today there are 27,000 distinct items in that collection. And it's everything from emblems, buttons, paper, and photography from the late 19th century to today. For many, many years, David collected these items in his basement, and in fact, he is still collecting. But he decided a few years back to donate the collection to Simon Fraser University. And I think the David York collection, there's an example in here that tells us why archives really matter, that in fact archives can change history. When we look at the labor movement in BC since the early 20th century, it's been argued that there are a few significant milestones that we can talk about. 1918, 1919, we talked about Ginger Goodwin, the first general strike. The First World War was ending. There'd been a worldwide pandemic, sounding familiar, a war in Europe, a pandemic. Millions were killed in war and in disease. Unemployment was high, and the working class was looking for change. And in 1919, the Winnipeg General Strike occurred. It captured that anger and became a catalyst for sympathy strikes that spread across Canada, notably in BC, where even in Vancouver, 10,000 workers went out on strike for a month. So that was, I think, a very significant event. The unemployment crisis of the 1930s was another major event, as was the achievement of union recognition during the Second World War. And some have argued that British Columbia's Solidarity Movement of 1983 was also another significant benchmark for labor. Now, I believe that it can be argued that the Supreme Court of Canada decision in 2005 on collective bargaining and the Constitution can be historically seen as another milestone. And there is a direct connection to the David York Labor History Collection. A bit of background. In 2002, the then BC Liberal government of Premier Gordon Campbell passed legislation that stripped language from freely bargained collective agreements, mainly in the healthcare sector, that had provided job security to workers and prevented their jobs from being privatized. Suddenly, their employers were permitted to contract out their positions previously held by government workers, even though Campbell had just been reelected in an election campaign where he swore he would not do it. Immediately, employers began firing thousands of unionized hospital workers. These were laundry, dietary, and housekeeping workers, 80% of whom were women, many the lowest paid in healthcare. Their jobs were contracted out to private companies, and if they wanted their jobs back, they had to reapply for them. And the new employer was paying a lot less. Many people, many cleaners, for example, who were making $18 an hour, were rehired at $10. So naturally, there was outrage to this unprecedented attack on collective bargaining. Teachers and social service workers were also swept up by similar legislation, and the unions affected launched a constitutional challenge. When the case reached the Supreme Court of Canada, there was a coalition of unions that intervened, and included in that coalition was the BC Teachers Federation. And at the time, David York was a staff lawyer for the BC Teachers Federation, and he became part of the health union's legal team. Their job was to argue that collective bargaining was a right achieved by workers over 100 years ago, and therefore the BC government's legislation was a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, David recalled that in his collection, in his basement, he had an obscure pamphlet called Food for Thought, Collective Bargaining in Canada, issued by the Workers' Educational Association in 1941. And it was an article by Bora Laskin, who was then a young law professor, but he later became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada and the country's most respected expert in constitutional and labor law. David had never before or since seen a copy of this article. And in it, Laskin made a compelling case for the fundamental importance of collective bargaining. So David York included those arguments in the submission to the court. He appended a copy of the article to the union's submission, an act that he said was he admitted was highly unusual. Well, on June the 8th, 2005, the Supreme Court accepted Bora Laskin's argument, made so many decades prior, and affirmed that collective bargaining is protected by Canada's Charter of Rights. And they quoted Bora Laskin's definition, found in Food for Thought, because David had collected and remembered an obscure pamphlet in his archive. So what began as a 10-year-old collection of union buttons resulted in an enormous victory for labor nationwide. And Canada's unions now recognize June the 8th every year as Collective Bargaining Rights Day, the anniversary of the Supreme Court decision. So that's, I think, hopefully you'll find that an inspiring reason to continue to do the work that you do. As the Labor Heritage Center, we do a lot with a very modest amount of resources. We have 2 part-time staff, and the secret ingredient is that we love what we do. I hope I've been able to explain a bit about our relationship to archival collections. We're very excited and very hopeful about what Crossing Fonds will achieve for small organizations such as ours. So thank you, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you. That was very interesting, just with the history of, labor in BC. I'm really curious, given kind of all the mobilization you have with podcasts, curriculum, walking tours, if you could talk about kind of how that's coordinated from, such a diverse collection. Must take a lot of time and planning to do. And
Well, like I said, we love our work. It does. We have a lot of volunteers, like people who've been active in the labor movement all their lives are very motivated to see that that work continues to be represented and shared. So as the executive director, I kind of do a lot of that traffic handling of, hey, here's a podcast about this. We should put that in the curriculum project. And that's, that kind of work is done by volunteers. Mhm.
No, I don't think so.
Donna, I'm really curious about when you choose to act as an archive. And how do you make that decision? And which records do you then accept? I mean, you have a great partnership with SFU on,
Yeah.
some of the.
We
the
don't say
formats.
no to anything because I can't stand the thought of something disappearing. And, we get the agreement when anyone who donates anything is get the agreement, sign it, say, what do you want us to do with it if we don't want it? And everyone, I think mostly people just want to get rid of the stuff. So as time permits, and I will admit that there's a backlog of stuff right now. We sort it, describe it, do the usual stuff, and ultimately it won't stay with us because we don't have the space or the resources to act as an archive. So we have an archival services agreement with the SFU. So likely it will go there, or if it fits better into the collection at UBC, we'll send it there. Or now that the IWA archive exists in Lake Cowichan, we have sent a lot of stuff there as well. If it's related to that union, they take it.
Can you talk a little bit about your user base? I mean, it's been an interesting time for labor organization. We've seen a number of, I guess, types of jobs which are very precarious try to organize. So, people who are Uber drivers or food delivery. And do they come to you to look at that history? I mean, that's how I got involved with, labor history and archives was because I was an activist and
Yeah.
there just wasn't the kind of information I needed to make decisions.
We find more now that people come to it, like researchers will come and say, I'm looking for something on this, and we tell them where to go because now we kind of know where stuff is. So we'll send them places. With the, the new organizing initiatives, I'll tell you a story about one that's happened recently is with our labor history curriculum. We provide resources for teachers, and the curriculum mandates, of course, keep changing. So there's now a section in the curriculum where they explore social activism and what you can do to change things in society. So we were rewriting a lesson plan, and I mentioned to the teacher who was working on it, well, you're using an example here of child labor in Mexico. Is there maybe a better example that might resonate more with students in British Columbia? And we kind of landed on the Starbucks organizing that's been going on. And the Tyee, I don't know if you know the Tyee, the online newspaper, had just done a series of articles on Starbucks organizing. So I asked them if we could reprint them, and they said yes. So we're putting them in a lesson plan for schools because we think kids will understand that type of union organizing. Many of them may have even worked at a Starbucks or hope to work at a Starbucks. So that's sort of keeping one ear open as to what's going on in the labor movement and seeing if it can connect with any of the work that we do.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
My name's Carolyn. You'd mentioned 3 repositories that you are now able to pass off material to, since you don't have the space necessarily or the resources to do that. At any point, or have you at any point reached out to other institutions as well? So if you came across archival material that was fit to a very specific community that had a community archive, would you reach out to them?
Oh, probably, yeah, yeah.
And have you had experience with that yet?
No, because the major like labor archives or the union collections are in very specific places. Like we know where they are. They're mainly UBC and SFU, and some of the older collections, they're also at the Vancouver archives and BC archives. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for all the work that you and your colleagues do. I'm involved in looking at policy for archives, and I'm going to talk about it a bit tomorrow. But I was really struck when you were talking about your difficulty accessing like 45 seconds of footage from the CBC and probably others. Can you just, and I'm sure this is maybe an issue that others have encountered. Can you just talk about what that encounter is and like what's their?
What are they saying?
Yeah, what are they saying? Like, why are they charging you? Or like, have you tried to say that it's for for fair dealing purposes, for educational, blah blah, like all that stuff?
Yeah. Or I saved all the emails because it was a long chain. They say it's, they have licensing rights, and they sent it back to me with the rate card and said, this is what we charge. And I said, I pulled we're a small nonprofit, we can't really afford this. And they said, well, everyone tells us that. And then we had to, it was, being used in a podcast. So we had to submit the script for the podcast so they could see the context in which it was being used. I said, well, can I at least get a copy of the recording so we can listen to it and see whether we want to use it? Yes, they could do that. So then we had to identify the 45 seconds that we wanted from it. And then, it was we're short-staffed, we can't do it. And they ended up, it went from $1,500 they were going to charge us, and I think we finally paid $300. But, and had to sign our life away that we wouldn't use it for any purposes that we hadn't explained in the contract. And yeah, but, it's very frustrating because, the CBC Archives has incredible stuff. They've got incredible interviews, and it's a public organization. Yeah. Are you from the CBC? No. Oh.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm not.
Okay.
No. I'm doing research on like policy issues around audiovisual archives, and so copyright access is one of those issues, right? So I was just very interested to learn more about your case.
Yeah.
I'll just anecdotally say that, when I was producing my sort of docu-fiction works, we went dumpster diving at the CBC here in Vancouver because we got the word that they were tossing out like massive amounts of reel-to-reel and it was pre-Betacam, 3/4 inch, and it was all about women and racialized communities. And we just found this treasure trove of stuff that they were tossing out, like they were literally throwing it out. So then we kind of had, then it was an interesting problem. Like, do you have to pay them for the rights of something they're throwing out? Or do you just use it and, see what happens?
And the lawyers came.
Oh, I'm not. I know we're streaming out to the CBC. Anyhow, Donna, thank you so much. Thanks, as others have said, thank you so much for the work you do. It's really important work.
If you go to our website, laborheritagecenter.ca, there's a newsletter subscribe button. And once a month, we publish a newsletter, and we try to have original research in each newsletter. So sign up if you want.
Thank you. Thanks so much.